Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, as tensions escalate in the Gulf, U.S. announces sending another 1,000 troops in the region, and Iran warns it's nearing the end of the 10-day deadline for low-grade uranium enrichment. Spokesman for Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Mr. Behrouz Kamalvandi, said Iran has quadrupled the rate of enrichment of uranium and that it would surpass the 300-kilogram limit imposed by the multilateral anti-nuclear deal. Now, enriched low-grade uranium is a key product in nuclear weapons. Now, Germany and Japan are coming up and saying that they need more evidence from the U.S., who accuses Iran for attacking those oil tankers in the Hormuz Strait. Now, crucial international route for oil tankers is this area where up till now 4 different oil tankers have been attacked in the last 30 days. The U.S. Secretary of State has released more videos and pictures on Monday of a small boat full of Iranian soldiers approaching one of the oil tankers. Meanwhile, there is no formal investigation going on. Of course, the UN has come out and said that there should be a formal investigation. Until then, everybody needs to calm down. But the strategy that the U.S. continues to employ escalates tensions in the region. And what we're trying to investigate today on this episode of the Newswire is whether this strategy is on track for the U.S. policy in the Middle East, or is it starting to show signs that it might be backfiring. For that, I'd like to welcome our guests who are joining us. We have with us Dr. Jeffrey C., a national security consultant, also a former State Department official in the Obama administration, and he's also the author of the book Integrating Europe. Dr. Jeffrey, the footage and the videos, the pictures that are coming out from the U.S. State Department showing that a small boat is approaching one of the oil tankers and trying to scrape off something from the side of it, that it has Iranian soldiers. Is this evidence enough right now, at this point, to warrant U.S.'s strategy on building up forces in the Middle East?
Well, yes and no. On the one hand, it's fairly clear evidence that the Iranians have actually, as accused, been responsible for mining the tankers. But that's a different question, whether or not that justifies the military buildup. Part of the reason why the world is questioning this is because of the lack of credibility of the Trump administration in previous episodes. So there are really multiple aspects to this. On the one hand, the Iranians are testing out where the red lines really are. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the Trump administration, the president himself, has said that he doesn't want a war, has described his advisors of misleading him, etc. Mm-hmm. And even yesterday, describing these attacks on the tankers as really not being sufficient enough evidence to go to war. You've got a situation where, unfortunately, tensions are still rising at the same time when the U.S. president is sending conflicting signals.
He is sending conflicting signals, which is really adding to this sort of the tensions escalating here. Like, for example, yesterday during an interview to the Time magazine, he said that he would do anything, even go to war with Iran, if it meant stopping them from getting armed with nuclear weapons.
That's correct. So it's really difficult to ascertain, if you're an Iranian analyst or the supreme leader himself, where the U.S. red lines really are. And so miscalculation can actually lead directly to conflict here, an exchange of fire that could rapidly escalate and get right into an armed conflict, which would be sustained and, for the Iranians, quite negative in the end. So it's really dangerous.
But at the same time, he's come out and said, not just President Trump has said this, but different senior U.S. officials have come out and said that we don't want a war with Iran. We are not interested in fighting. Their allies have come out and said that. Is this just posturing? Because it is just 1,000 troops. That's not much to fight a war with a country like Iran, is it?
Well, on the other hand, you have other assets in the region, in the Gulf itself, primarily Air Force and naval. So the kind of attack that would take place would not be essentially something about occupying Iran. There isn't time for that, and that is one of the reasons why the Iranians themselves are skeptical that the U.S. will actually go through with this. So the conflicting signals are actually more dangerous. Here in the second phase, when supposedly tensions are down somewhat, the ability for miscalculation to lead to an exchange of fire is greater. On the one hand, the president, if he really didn't want war, should probably consistently apply pressure to persuade the Iranians that if they lob missiles around or bomb tankers, that could lead to a U.S. attack. By saying that he doesn't want these things and that these attacks on the tankers are insufficient to go to war, that leads the Iranians to be more brazen and to test where the red lines are, and therefore potentially bring about war when in fact both sides don't actually want war.
And the U.S. president has also said in the past few days that these attacks, they're a very small incident essentially. And what at the same time we hear the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, say, he's criticized, and this is an interview he did with not just Fox and Friends, but another time on Fox News just 2 days ago, where he basically criticized the Obama administration, putting the blame on them, essentially. You've been part of the Obama administration. Do you agree with Pompeo's statement that essentially Obama's administration is responsible for strengthening Iran and making it giving it the encouragement to be the kind of bully it is right now?
Not the case. In fact, tensions came way down during the Obama administration because of the Iranian nuclear deal. The JCPOA was an effective instrument for lowering tensions, something that the Iranians wanted very much, something that they abided by, something that actually reduced their ability to procure nuclear weapons capabilities. Unfortunately, over time, by threatening the Iranians and eventually by walking away from the deal and then applying this so-called maximum pressure campaign, this has brought about more tension, more sort of low-grade conflict than had been the case previously. So we've got essentially everything but a war now, whereas before we had moderation and a test during the Obama administration for the Iranians. Eventually, there was a possibility, for example, of them to enter negotiations about other missiles and these sorts of things, non-nuclear capabilities, and add them to the agreements on hand.
Right.
That's what was being tested in the previous administration. Now we're entirely far away from that, and Iran is closer to obtaining nuclear weapons and violating the deal.
The JCPOA, something that the U.S. was the first to withdraw. But right now the situation, Dr. Jeffrey, seems to be getting worse. Iran, on the other hand, continues to escalate its enrichment of low-grade uranium, saying that it'll end in 10 days. Where do you see this headed? Are they both just sort of bluffing? Are they trying to see who bends first? How do you see this?
Basically, the enrichment move is really aimed at the Europeans to try to pressure them to come up with a way to get around U.S. sanctions. They've created this so-called special purpose vehicle, a device that would allow transactions to take place and oil sales to go through. This is what Iran needs, but it hasn't been used yet, and it's still proven not to be necessarily workable for them.
Right.
So they're looking for some other way, for example, getting them to get the U.S. to back down and release some of these sanctions. That's really the aim here.
Right.
Of course, you can quickly solve this by adding some other form of uranium that isn't as enriched and dilute it pretty quickly. So it's not like this is going to be some breakout to get to nuclear weapons in a very short period of time. There's still plenty of time to keep the deal in place.
How can Europe really play a role here when we see U.S., whether it's posturing or it's psychological warfare, sending more troops, relocating their Patriot batteries, sending more sort of arms and ammunitions and Air Force? I mean, there are rumors coming out, reports coming out, and rumors coming out that an expected 6,000 more troops might be stationed there in the next few days. How far do you think President Trump is willing to go?
He's made some very serious threats, and the assets obviously are now in place to carry out a sustained attack, which would lead to at least a small-scale war, if not a major one. The idea here is to avoid war. Both sides want to avoid war, but both of them are posturing and not necessarily calculating accurately, and the tensions are rising. So we really have a situation where they've got to each side, and really it's the U.S. that must find a way to give something to Iran to incentivize actually sitting down to talk. You really have disincentivized things by removing yourself from the deal and then making these threats and moving these military assets into place. If I were the Iranians, on those terms, I wouldn't talk either. The Trump administration has to understand that it's in its own interest to offer some off-ramp, some way to climb down from where the tensions are at present, some incentive to actually talk and lead to a resolution of the situation, possibly another deal, an extended deal. That's what we need now.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey. Now we're joined by Ms. Barbara Slavin. She's the director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. You're joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Newswire. Ms. Barbara, we've been talking about the images that were released by the U.S. State Department that basically show a boat approaching the tankers and trying to remove something from the hull. These black and white images were released about a week ago, and then again on Monday, more footage was shown as evidence that Iran is responsible for the attacks on these oil tankers. There's a lot of question over the credibility. Japan and Germany has refused to accept this as enough evidence to put the blame on Iran. What do you make of this?
Yeah, well, look, I'm not in a position to say whether these photographs are, going to prove that Iran was responsible for these incidents or not. However, I think what is interesting about the international response is that it shows how nervous the international community is about the wisdom of the Trump administration in terms of its dealings with Iran. Most of the world opposed the United States' decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal a year ago. Most of the world is upset by U.S. efforts to put a total embargo on the export of Iranian oil. And given that President Trump is rather unpredictable and that he has some advisors who are extremely hawkish on Iran, I think there is a real desire not to give these claims credibility, simply to prevent the United States from taking some sort of military action against Iran in retaliation. And it's a terrible situation for the U.S. to be in, frankly.
It's a terrible situation for the U.S. to be in, but there's something that you said here about how the world is responding, and it shows that they're nervous about this kind of escalating tensions here. I want to sort of refer to also something you said in an article you wrote for The Interpreter in January 2017, where you said, let me quote, "Our president has a lot to learn and has shown a limited capacity to evolve." Do you still stick by those words?
We have seen Donald Trump has quit a number of international agreements, claiming that somehow he would be able to negotiate better deals for these agreements. And so far, we have not seen any indication that that is true. He has certain instincts, but he doesn't have an ability seemingly to follow through. And in the case of Iran, he has now surrounded himself with extremely hawkish advisors who I don't think are interested in a negotiation with Iran. I think they're simply interested in weakening Iran. And of course, Iran is showing that it can retaliate.
And I suppose you're referring to here the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. You're talking about Mike Bolton. They've been known and criticized by analysts across the board around the world for having been sort of being very trigger happy when it comes to Iran. And Bolton doesn't have much to go by when it comes to credibility for being objective here, as he was one of the architects of the Iraq wars.
Yes, John Bolton in particular, the National Security Advisor, has been very hawkish about Iran. It's not just that he's written articles suggesting that the only solution to the Iranian nuclear program is to bomb Iran. He also has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from an organization called the Mujahideen Halq, which is a violent cult that opposes the Iranian government, that periodically has conferences, and they have paid speakers from, I'm sorry to say, both American political parties, but John Bolton and Rudy Giuliani, another advisor of President Trump, have been among the most prominent people appearing at these events. So he is not an objective person. And as you point out, he was also, of course, a part of the George W. Bush administration, which used exaggerated, hyped, phony intelligence to justify the invasion of Iraq. So this is also a problem.
What do commander of the UN Central Command, General McKenzie, maybe that he would be able to counter this extreme sort of warmongering almost attitude that Pompeo and Bolton are known for?
Well, the head of Central Command is not somebody who can come up against the National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State. May I remind you that we don't even have a confirmed Secretary of Defense. So the problem is there's no one of any stature or sufficient rank to really come up against Trump. Now, that said, the President of the United States does not want a war with Iran, and I would say that most members of the uniformed military in the United States do not want a war with Iran. So what we're seeing now is a lot of threats, a lot of signaling back and forth. One hopes that cooler heads will prevail. President Trump has actually contradicted his advisors. He said the other day in an interview that the attacks on the tankers were, quote unquote, very minor, clearly showing that he does not want to use those incidents as an excuse to retaliate militarily against Iran.
He also, in an interview, I believe it's the same one, said that he would go to any lengths, even a war, if it meant to denuclearize Iran. So it does make the world worry then, rightly so, don't you think, that this man is not really looking for a political solution? Because what Javad Zarif has said already, it's an economic terrorism on the people of Iran who are getting crushed every day by a spiraling economy with these sanctions.
Yeah, I think President Trump would love to get a better deal, so-called, from Iran. He just doesn't know how to do it, and he doesn't have the personnel who are capable of doing it. The Iranians, yes, they are threatening now to breach the limits in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which would probably effectively signal that this agreement is dead. There will need to be new negotiations. I think the question is whether they will be with the Trump administration or whether they will be with a successor to the Trump administration. How much longer can the Iranians go with these economic sanctions? Will we begin to see more countries trade with Iran despite the sanctions? There are reports that there are several tanker loads of oil on their way to China as we speak. So perhaps the Chinese will signal that they are willing to violate the sanctions and essentially call the bluff of the United States, dare the United States to go after them. We're in a trade war with China right now.
Right.
So the Chinese may be feeling they have nothing more to lose. It's a very worrisome picture. And of course, as you pointed out, the biggest losers in all of this, the people who are suffering most, are the Iranian people who do not deserve this economic war.
Now, President Trump's policy, as we can see similarities, and I wonder if you would agree with this, not just with Iran, but generally across the board, how he tends to pressure countries or regimes into a corner until they agree. Now, what we're seeing with Iran is the enrichment is going up. They're scaling up very quickly. And as they say, their head of Atomic Energy Commission says, well, we're going to surpass that 300 kilogram limit in 10 days. That does worry the region. But at the same time, we've seen the State Department spokesman, Morgan Ortagus, come out and say these sanctions, the U.S. sanctions on Iran, have negatively affected the militias that Iran has been known to fund. So isn't U.S. really getting what it wants? Why ramp up the pressure further?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is to some extent getting what it wants in terms of weakening Iran. On the other hand, as we've seen, Iran has ways to make the international community pay, whether it be tanker traffic in the Persian Gulf or threats to increase its enrichment of uranium to higher and higher levels. This will not be cost-free for the United States or anyone else. And it's just so unnecessary. I mean, why did Trump have to withdraw from this agreement to begin with and create this unnecessary crisis? He could have sought negotiations on other aspects and could have offered incentives to Iran instead of the so-called maximum pressure campaign, which I think is backfiring.
You think it's backfiring, but it really still puts into question how far is the White House going to go, because there are reports coming in that Hamas in Gaza is going through an austerity drive. They're really out of funds. We're seeing Hezbollah put up billboards all across different parts of Lebanon saying they're asking for donations. So essentially, doesn't it seem like these proxies that U.S. is ready to point fingers on Iran, that Iran is funding, are taking a step back? Maybe President Trump should also?
Well, you know, there are also reports that rockets have been fired toward international oil company installations in Iraq. There were some rockets fired in the direction of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad.
But there's no evidence as of yet who could be behind those rockets.
They're apparently coming from militias that have been supported by Iran. Hezbollah has asked for donations forever. I mean, I visited Beirut more than a decade ago, and there are boxes there into which people are supposed to put their donations. I think all of these entities have other ways of maintaining themselves. I do not see that this is a successful posture on the part of the United States.
Do you think that it will take a regime change in Iran for the U.S. to back off?
God, I hope not. I think the Iranians have been through enough. No, I think it's going to take an ability on the part of the Trump administration or a successor to resume talks with Iran on a realistic basis, not the 12 demands of Mike Pompeo, which in effect would call for regime change, but realistic talks. We need de-escalation, not escalation.
And for de-escalation, we would need an intermediary, an objective body. I mean, there have been different countries that have raised their heads here. China has called for de-escalation. Russia has said it, that things are getting really heated. Japan's premier was in Iran recently. I mean, but nothing seems to be sort of bringing down the heat here.
Well, you know, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. I think the United States and Iran need to talk to each other directly. That is the only formula that worked in the past, and it's the only formula that will work now. And, you know, it's great that Prime Minister Abe and that the Omani Sultan and the German foreign minister and all these other people, may I add Imran Khan also, have tried to cool the tensions. This is all to the good. But the United States and Iran need to speak directly, and so the president needs to designate some sort of envoy to speak to Iran. And Iran has a very capable new ambassador at the United Nations, by the way, a former nuclear negotiator named Majid Takhtravanchi. He would be an ideal person to begin such discussions. But the United States doesn't even have a confirmed UN ambassador. So here the dysfunction of the Trump administration once again gets in the way of diplomacy.
It's coming in the way of diplomacy. Really wise words there. Thank you so much, Barbara. Barbara Slavin was joining us from Washington, D.C. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Chinese President Xi Jinping will be in North Korea tomorrow on a 2-day state visit. This will be the first such visit in 14 years by a Chinese president to North Korea. And the timing couldn't be more ripe. It comes a week before President Xi is to meet U.S. President Donald Trump for talks on the sidelines of the G20 summit to be held in Japan. China-U.S. relations have been bitter since the trade war between the two started in 2018. Now, with the G20 meeting coming up, the two countries are also expected to discuss development of Sino-North Korean relations, which basically means how China can pressure North Korea to denuclearize. But first, to give you a context into how historically relationships have been between Beijing and Pyongyang, let's take a look at this report.
North Korea and China's friendship dates back to the 1950s, when during the Korean War, Chinese troops helped North Korea fight against South Korea. Since then, China has backed North Korean leaders both politically and economically. But their relationship hit a bump in October 2006, when North Korea violated a September 2005 six-party accord, in which Pyongyang agreed to abandon its pursuit of nuclear weapons. China then backed a UN Security Council resolution that imposed sanctions on North Korea. After North Korea's 2017 ballistic missile launch test, Beijing again called on Pyongyang to de-escalate tensions on the Korean peninsula. But China's punitive measures towards its southern neighbour have been criticised for not being genuine, as it's blamed for circumventing sanctions and continuing unofficial trade. China is North Korea's biggest trade partner and arguably has the most leverage on Kim Jong-un's regime. While trade volume has decreased between China and North Korea since the sanctions, political support continues between the two. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met North Korean leader Kim Jong-un several times since he took power. The first was a secret meeting in Beijing, where Kim reiterated a commitment to denuclearization and a dialogue with the US. They again met in May 2018, in June again the same year, and January 2019. Each time these meetings preceded talks between Pyongyang and Washington, D.C.
We will be discussing how this relationship is evolving, what role North Korea is playing and can be expected to play in the US-China trade war, and what Beijing's role will be in reining in Pyongyang's ambitions to denuclearization. We are joined by Mr. Andrew Leung. He's an international independent analyst joining us from Hong Kong. Welcome to Newswire, Mr. Andrew. Let's talk a little about what this relationship could mean. We see President Xi about to visit right before the G20 summit in North Korea to meet with Kim Jong-un. What do you think this relationship, as it's evolving, what role can it play, especially when it comes to North Korea's denuclearization?
Well, of course, North Korea has been a long-time ally of Beijing. But it's only in recent years that North Korea became a little recalcitrant, even acting at odds with Beijing's kind of preference in the nuclearization program and vis-a-vis the United States. But I think that now the talks with President Xi between Kim and President Xi broke down, and then of course Kim was very, very surprised by this outcome. And of course, in the increasing 360 degrees pushback by the United States against China on all fronts, including technology, including trade, including human rights, including South China Sea. So ahead of the G20, President Xi wants to gather more negotiating cards with his forthcoming talks with President Trump. But also, President Xi prefers to resolve the nuclearization crisis in North Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, through diplomatic means, through political means, rather than through military coercion. In fact, it has been China's policy all along. In any international conflict, it's much better to resolve the issue rather by adopting unilateral kind of military coercive tactics, which could stabilize the entire peninsula. So I think that this meeting is important. The timing is important.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andrew, for your opinion there. Now we're joined by Mr. Feingold, who is an analyst, a political risk analyst, who's joining us from Taiwan. Welcome to Newswire. Mr. Ross, let's talk a little about what we were asking Mr. Andrew earlier. What's your take on US-China trade war having an effect, essentially, on how Beijing might be using Pyongyang as a leverage ahead of these G20 summit?
Well, one of the things that U.S. presidents, not just Donald Trump, but his predecessors as well, have struggled with is where does China factor into our dealings with North Korea and the need to address the very significant security risk that is presented by North Korea's missile as well as nuclear weapons programs. So at times, the U.S. has sought to capture China's cooperation and maybe not have been as tough on China with issues such as human rights or religious freedom or trade issues. But now we're in an environment where the United States is tough on China increasingly on these other issues, whether it's trade or human rights or sovereignty disputes in the South China Sea. And we see that U.S. policymakers are willing to criticize China for not cooperating on North Korea sanctions, for example, But we still see that President Trump continues to say that he maintains friendly relations with Xi Jinping, even Kim Jong-un. And that's typically Donald Trump's approach when he's referring to his relationship with any world leaders. So the struggle remains, but the overriding security concern needs to be addressed. And the United States ultimately is going to do whatever it has to do to address those security concerns, regardless of how China feels. So
now, the problem with the U.S. is, I understand what you're saying here, but the problem with how U.S. or more likely President Trump's policy on trying to get somebody to the negotiating table and essentially agree to his terms and conditions is that he ends up leaving very little to be negotiated, essentially cornering them. What we've seen happening in the Middle East with Iran is a perfect example of that. And now it has problems with China, but what we're seeing here is President Trump being rather relaxed with how he approaches Kim Jong-un. I mean, despite the fact that there were missile tests and despite the fact that the Hanoi summit was a complete failure, there doesn't seem to be much pressure on North Korea, or is there?
Well, that's certainly the common criticism. On the other hand, and President Trump likes to point this out, notwithstanding the recent missile tests, the long-range missile tests have temporarily ceased. Nuclear tests have ceased for a significant period of time. There has been some cooperation on searching for the remains of American soldiers from the Korean War. So there are some positives, and we have to be fair to President Trump when he cites those things, because that is the reality. The United States also maintains a very strong dialogue on North Korea issues with its security partners in Northeast Asia, which are South Korea and Japan. So there's not a lot of separation between the U.S. and its allies in the region on these issues. So there's a large number of positives that are taking place. Ultimately, though, are the sanctions going to work? Is international pressure going to work? Or will we have to return to an even stronger military posture near North Korea, including more troops in South Korea, more military exercises, for example? These are all actions that the U.S. government and the Trump administration are going to take, regardless of how China feels about protecting its ally, North Korea.
Right. And here we're joined by Ms. Claudia Astarita. She's an analyst joining us from... Ms. Claudia, just talking about how U.S. or Trump's strategy really is in trying to bring everybody to the negotiating table, while he might be rather relaxed with Kim Jong-un at the moment. What we're seeing with escalating tensions between U.S. and China is that they might be losing this battle, do you think, with China cozying up to Kim to get them on their side?
I think we will see tomorrow. We will see. Well, there are already some very promising statements that have been made by Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping said that actually, no matter what, the relationship between China and South Korea and North Korea will remain very strong, and that China is willing to support North Korea. This is very important, especially from Xi Jinping, because he's a leader that he hasn't been connecting very well with Kim Jong-un at the beginning of the Kim Jong-un leadership. So this is showing that things are changing. This is showing that North Korea and China have continued negotiating throughout all these months, and this made this official visit for the 7th anniversary of the diplomatic ties between the two countries possible in Pyongyang. And then it will be up to Trump at this stage to catch up with what the leaders are doing in order not to lose the ground that he gained in terms of bilateral negotiation with North Korea.
Right. So, Ross, while we're still on this, do you think the letter that Kim Jong-un sent to President Trump last week might have also helped in his favor?
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt. But ultimately, the negotiating teams from the two countries are going to have to meet, and they're going to have some substantive progress. And that's where the gap is that led to the failure of the Hanoi summit. So exchanges of letters are nice, and obviously President Trump likes to cite these things as proof that his approach, his style of dealing with Kim Jong-un works. But we're still going to need to see some substantive outcomes, and most of the movement really has to come from the North Korea side. And whether or not China will prompt the North Koreans to do that or it's a decision that North Korea is going to make unilaterally based on its own primarily economic interests, really remains to be seen. But I think one important thing we have to keep in mind with Xi Jinping visiting North Korea is, despite all the speculation in recent years that this relationship has kind of frayed between China and North Korea, China has repeatedly made it clear by its actions, not necessarily its words, that it is not going to leave or it won't have the back of its ally, North Korea. And we see that with China implementing sanctions, but there's always some leakage, right? There's always some violations on the Chinese side, just enough to keep the North Korean economy going along. So whether or not North Korea is going to make some concessions vis-a-vis its negotiations with the United States, it's probably not something that China is going to say to North Korea, you need to do this. It's going to have to be a unilateral decision that North Korea makes, and probably the trigger for that will be the impact of sanctions.
Now, Ms. Claudia, do you think that this could be possibly how it would unfold sidelines of G20 in a few days, that the U.S. would accommodate possibly a accord with China and North Korea? Now, the sanctions that our guest is talking about, Mr. Ross is talking about, China was behind those back in 2006. And yes, there has been an official trade, but at the same time, to the tune of 80% of that trade with North Korea and China has gone down. So it seems like China is doing its part in trying to contain stability in the region.
Well, China has been complying, can we say, more seriously than it used to be to the respect of sanctions. And this was a new thing. And this was actually another pressure that was put over North Korea to understand that it couldn't rely on China as much as it used to before. And it had to do concession to China too in order to keep China on its side. At the same time, I think the situation remains very problematic. I agree with the fact that it would be up to North Korea to make concession and to gain the trust of its interlocutors. Either we are talking about South Korea or China or the United States. At this stage, though...
But it would be very hard, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Ms. Claudia, but wouldn't it be very hard to gain their trust with an administration that in itself has been known to go back on its commitments? Here I'm just talking about the JCPOA that they withdrew from, and now they're throwing a big fuss about it in the Middle East, essentially bringing the region close to war. So, I mean, isn't it fair for North Korea to expect equal amount of concessions in terms of sanctions?
No. This is not fair at all, but this is what North Korea wants. At the same time, I think that war is not a good option for anybody. So at the end of the day, while North Korea will never accept to completely denuclearize without having something exchanged before, at the other side, if we really want to reach a compromise, we need to find a formula that would accommodate North Korean needs in terms of how to show to the country and to the leadership that they succeeded in some way in winning a negotiation with the United States, and forcing North Korea to, to respect the pacts and the agreement that maybe one day will be reached. What is really changing the pattern here is the role of China, because China hasn't had a very active role in the negotiation, and now China is trying to get it back. However, we also need to consider that one of the main reasons why China wants that, yes, it's true, it's also because China wants to maintain stability in the region, and China doesn't trust Kim Jong-un at all. So this was this was clear in the first year of the Kim Jong-un era and the way in which China was interacting with North Korea. At the same time, China has another very important issue to solve, which is the trade war with the United States. Absolutely. And there, another compromise needs to be found very urgently. So if from one perspective, China can, let's say, gain something in the compromise of the trade war by supporting the United States in their deal with North Korea, right. Yes, we can say that this could be a switch and let's say a tit-for-tat agreement between the two. At the same time, while China and the United States can agree on something, when North Korea is involved, whatever they agree on could be compromised by a step back or a change of mind in the North Korean regime. So whatever they achieve cannot be taken. No.
So, Mr. Ross, let's get your take on this. Do you think that there could be a compromise here, or that the the issues that U.S. and China, besides trade, they're also having problems in the South China Sea here. Do you think that the U.S. policy could change? Maybe they could backtrack a little bit on their aggressive stance that they've shown in the South China Sea with patrolling there in order to get North Korea to agree on these terms and conditions?
I think a greater likelihood is that these issues move forward, but separately. So a trade agreement is within reach from the perspective that for many months, the two sides have been negotiating. Each side knows what the issues are. They know what the other side wants in trade negotiations. It's now a question of whether or not concessions will be offered. And for the most part, those concessions need to come from the Chinese side rather than the U.S. side. South China Sea sovereignty, territory disputes over islands and freedom of navigation. This issue is not going to go away. So there's no scope for an agreement. Again, on North Korea, China might go along with whatever North Korea agrees with, but I don't see China taking a leadership role from a perspective of forcing or pressuring North Korea to do anything, nor would China be able to force or pressure the U.S. administration to make concessions to North Korea. That is just not an option that U.S. policymakers are willing to listen to. The security concerns as they impact U.S. allies, South Korea and Japan, are so significant that there's really no scope for China to tell the United States and for the United States to agree with what China says vis-a-vis concessions to North Korea. I think it's more, again, of Xi Jinping just going along with whatever North Korea ultimately decides to do.
And if North Korea doesn't agree, do you think there is a realistic chance of U.S. taking military action against it?
Again, this is up to the North Koreans. In the past,
do you think President Trump would make a move like this so close to his election campaign, re-election campaign has already started for 2020. Do you think it would be a kind of move that you would expect, or you wouldn't put it past the White House at this moment?
I wouldn't expect it, but we can't put it past the White House from the perspective of, again, we have treaty allies in Northeast Asia, South Korea and Japan. The U.S. has obligations to come to their assistance. North Korea has taken numerous provocative actions, whether it's long-range missile tests or nuclear tests, that do cause concern. We have this issue of ship seizures. We don't know how North Korea might react. When U.S. military assets are in the air or at sea, the risk of incidents, of course, increases. And sometimes the North military can be very volatile. Kim Jong-un doesn't necessarily have control over what a commander in the field might decide to do at any given moment. So there's a lot of risk, but again, it would be unfair to put this risk onto the Trump administration when it's really up to North Korea not to engage in provocative actions.
So, okay, Ms. Claudia, let me just take forward the hypothetical situation. If this were to happen in the future, because there is, of course, the unpredictability that comes with North Korea's actions, and U.S. had to take a military action, it puts China in a really awkward position, doesn't it? Based on the 1964, the Sino-North Korean Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance, doesn't it? Where it basically calls for China to protect Pyongyang.
Yeah, this should. According to the existing agreements, yes, China should intervene, and China should intervene on the side of North Korea.
Even though China is not very keen about that clause. I mean, the treaty is coming up for sort of renewal in 2021. It's not very keen on this clause, is it?
No, definitely not, because, of course, the war is not something that China would ever consider, and I think none of the countries will. But this would be the obligation, and I think we just need to hope that this will never happen, to be honest, because otherwise there will be many complex relationships that will have to be deployed, and that will become real, and then it will be very complicated to keep the escalation down and just
right,
go
but the
back
problem at the same time remains that the way the U.S. approaches North Korea and the way China approaches North Korea are completely, the approach is very different. I mean, Beijing has continuously asked for world leaders, including the U.S., to take it easy and not press them in a corner. Do you think that U.S. might be ready to finally take heed to Beijing's advice?
I don't think, no. I don't think, again, that China can convince the United States of doing something different from what they are thinking at the moment. And at the moment, they want to keep this maximum pressure over North Korea. However, I think that what we can assume is that after what happened in Vietnam, the U.S. administration is thinking about alternative plans to find a way to compromise. without renouncing to the maximum pressure, but just trying to put it in another way that could be acceptable for North Korea to accept. And indeed, when Trump received Kim Jong-un letter, beyond saying that it was an extraordinary letter, he also added that in May, North Korea was not ready to negotiate. What does it mean? Does it mean that North Korea now wants to accept the U.S. condition? No, of course not. Does it mean that we're going to change the narrative to find a way to find a compromise? I think this could be an expectation on both sides, but this doesn't mean that both sides would really be able to find a sustainable compromise that can be acceptable for all the parties.
Right. And Mr. Ross, then do you think that while U.S. strategy seems to have been till now that China is part of the solution, has now started to change towards maybe China as part of the problem when it comes to North Korea?
That might be fair to say. Again, to the extent that there are sanctions violations, to the extent that China has a bit of a standoff approach, we kind of discussed it during this segment that maybe China's saying, well, look, don't push them into a corner, as opposed to taking a really strong stand to say, no, nuclear weapons and long-range missiles are absolutely unacceptable. Right? We don't see that from China, at least publicly, even though we know that they would prefer North Korea not have nuclear weapons. So the U.S. administration is filled with people who have very strong views, not only about North Korea, but about China as well, and about a range of Chinese policies, including foreign policy, trade policy, and many other policy areas. So, of course, this Trump administration is very skeptical of whether or not China can really provide substantive assistance on North Korea. That's why, again, I take the view that whatever decisions are going to be made are really going to be concessions by Kim Jong-un, probably because of the impact of the U.S. and the international sanctions. And China's just going to go along with whatever North Korea decides to do. But at the same time, China is not going to force North Korea to do anything, nor are they going to plead with the U.S. to take a more conciliatory approach either, because the U.S. is just not going to listen to that message from China.
But China could still play an important role in trying to bring North Korea to the table. Historically, I mean, just last year when President Xi met with Kim the first time, it was right after that. And in that meeting itself, that secret meeting that took place in Beijing, where Kim basically said that they were ready to talk to the U.S. on negotiating on denuclearization. Do you think then China still might have some cards that it could be playing to convince North Korea?
Oh, absolutely. Keeping in mind that China's foreign policy approach in many parts of the world tends to be, we're not going to intervene. Maybe there'll be multilateral or bilateral actions, and then we'll go along with what the global community decides to do. And that way, China is not the person who was insisting to one side or the other to take a certain position. Again, that seems to be their approach here. They're not forcing North Korea to do something it doesn't want to do. And then China could offer development assistance. Obviously, with North Korea, they could offer an enormous amount of trade, some of which, as we discussed, has been closed down because of the sanctions. So China would certainly want to be a player. They would want to be part of the team if North Korea and the United States, or North Korea and South Korea, North Korea and Japan reach a multilateral agreement. And China's going to want to go along, and they'll probably want to claim some of the credit as well, but they're going to want to be a player, if for economic reasons, at a minimum.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ross, for taking out the time and giving us your opinion on how this meeting could turn out and what it means for not just relationship with the U.S. and North Korea, but also U.S.-China relationship. And that's all the time we have for now. Thank you so much, Ms. Claudia, also for joining us. And with that, we've come to the end of the show. We'll see you again. Till then, goodbye.